problem. I'm Linda Baker, the Learning Director at the Centre for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children, and Annalise Stratman, our project manager, is here with me, and the rest of the team are personing stations at other locations to help make this a success today. On behalf of the whole team, I would like to welcome everyone to our webinar today. Wherever you are on Turtle Island today, please join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands, and in celebrating the continued strength and spirit of Indigenous peoples. We are bringing today's webinar from the Learning Network, funded by the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services, and the Knowledge Hub, funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada. Today's webinar is on Indigenous Cultural Responsiveness Theory, a new tool for improving health outcomes for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And it's presented today by Dr. JoLee Sasakamoose. And I just want to say that we had over 1,800 people register for this webinar. And from our perspective, that makes JoLee a rock star, which is very rare for those of you who don't know among professors in academic settings. So we're really excited because we know she's a rock star with substance. And before we introduce JoLee, I just want to walk us through our webinar format for the day. JoLee will present for 1 hour. So she'll present till 2 p.m. And during her presentation, we would invite you to type any comments or questions that you may have for her in the question and answer section or the chat box. And during the last 15 minutes, from 2 to 2:15, I will present as many of your questions as possible for JoLee to respond to. At the end of the webinar, in the chat box, you will see a link to an evaluation. And we really value your responses on that evaluation. In fact, today, for the very first time, we sent out JoLee's slides, the presenter's slides, earlier today. And that was based on feedback from participants who said they really wanted to print the slides and be able to make notes on them while the presenter was speaking. And so when you give us suggestions, those that we can act on, we really try to. And during the last part of the presentation, there will be a link in the chat box to the evaluation. And once you go there, you'll be able to complete your name after you finish the evaluation, and a certificate of participation will be generated and emailed to you. We also want to remind everybody that thanks to JoLee's generosity, a recording of this webinar will be posted on our website, and that an email will be sent out with the link to that recording to everybody that registered for today's webinar. With that, it is our pleasure to introduce Dr. JoLee Sasakamoose. JoLee is an Anishinaabe from the Three Fires Confederacy in Michigan and Ontario, with membership in the Michigan First Nation, and is an active citizen of Atakup Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. Dr. Sasakamoose is recently appointed Research Director of the Indigenous Wellness Research Community Network in Saskatchewan. And I just wanted to point out that the beautiful setting that JoLee is sitting in, and that you can see on your screen, is part of that wellness center, and she'll talk more about that. JoLee is an associate professor in educational psychology and counseling at the University of Regina. JoLee is a methodologist with the Saskatchewan Centre for Patient-Oriented Research, and in partnership with the First Nations communities of Saskatchewan, she authored the Indigenous Cultural Responsiveness Theory, a theoretical framework to guide research that improves the health of Indigenous peoples in Saskatchewan. JoLee has received funding from many provincial and national and other funders, and she also teaches group counseling, counseling girls and women, counseling children and youth, Indigenous Family Therapies, and decolonizing research methodologies. JoLee, we are delighted to have you present our webinar today, and with that, we turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that introduction. I'm quite stunned that there's so many people on the webinar, but I appreciate that. That tells me that there's interest and need in this topic, and so I'm more than willing to share our teachings and learnings that we've experienced in our research team. I would like to just first situate myself. I'm located right now in Treaty 4 territory and the homeland of the Métis, but I live and work in Treaty 4 and Treaty 6. I've been here about 9 years. I'm a guest in this treaty area, but I feel also like I've kind of embedded myself here over the last decade. First, I'd like to just model what we would call situating ourselves or locating ourselves. When Indigenous people tend to meet each other, we identify who we are, maybe our clan system, our families, where we're located. So today I'd like to just tell you a little bit about the network and why I might be qualified to actually have this conversation. Dr. Stuart Skinner and I, he's a chronic disease physician here in Saskatchewan. We run a lot of HIV programs in community. I don't know how many people know that Saskatchewan actually has the highest HIV rates in Canada. And so we do a lot of real hands-on interventions within First Nations communities, but we found that we were very limited by me being located within a Western institution of higher education and him being located within a hospital and within a health authority, that we started our own network, and that's called the Indigenous Wellness Research Community Network and Wellness Wheel Medical Clinic. And I was recently named the research director. So this is an Indigenous-led, nonprofit, community-centered network that engages holistic and strengths-based approaches to wellness research. Every single health intervention that we undertake is guided by knowledge keepers and elders in community. We call ourselves Wellness Wheel for short. We are an integrated collaboration of Indigenous communities, organizations, Indigenous researchers and scholars, First Nations, Métis, patient, family, peer, and community advisors, and healthcare professionals and providers. So with ceremonial guidance, Wellness Wheel was created to support a First Nations and Métis-led agenda in promoting health equity and renewal by building Indigenous wellness research capacities. So just to be quite honest, we felt we couldn't do the work within the confines of these Western systems, and we had to break out of those systems so that we could actually start to engage in what community was asking for. So today is the overview of our talk today, and I've put a extra group of slides in for resources with information on how to engage with Indigenous communities. I'll just say that our network put together this workshop as a full day, which I've condensed, or our team's condensed into the most critical points to support building relationships and partners between and within Indigenous and mainstream health systems. I'll also say that I'll use the word health, but you can flip that word out, health, to education, to governance, to policy. It is really applicable across all fields and all domains. So even if I'm a little health heavy, please substitute whatever field you're in. My goal today is not to tell you everything you need to know about Indigenous people, but to help you develop what we call cultural humility in order to build relationships with Indigenous people. And so when we develop cultural humility, the beauty of it is that it's not just applicable to Indigenous people, it works for all people. As opposed to cultural competency, which is the mastery of information about other groups, cultural humility is built on the concept of self-reflection and self-critique, skills critical to lifelong learning. So there's no way to know everything about every culture. It's not possible. We cannot become the experts. We need to shift that paradigm and learn what cultural humility is. Cultural humility is the stance towards understanding culture. It requires a commitment to lifelong learning, continuous self-reflection on one's own assumptions and practices. So that's a little bit of a different paradigm for people to really think about, that it's their own individual responsibility to be comfortable with not knowing. Most of the time, people from Western-based culture don't like not perceiving themselves as the expert, so it's a little bit of a coming out of the comfort zone. And it also recognizes the power and privilege imbalance that exists between clients and health professionals, teachers and students, etc. A cultural humility approach is interactive. We approach one another with an openness to learn. We ask questions rather than make assumptions, and we strive to understand rather than to inform. It's a very different approach, especially in the health field. I work with a lot of physicians and nurses and NPs, and to be quite honest, doctors think they know everything sometimes, and so it's a real paradigm shift for people, and even PhDs, we think we know it all, and then when we get somewhere, to actually humble yourself down so that you're not the expert and allow the patient, client, student to be the expert is really the approach to cultural humility. One of the questions I always ask, and I'm going to give you this question because I think it's universal and can be used in any setting, is there anything I should know about you or your culture to support you better in this process? And you can fill in the blank and make it specific to you. So is there anything I should know about you or your culture to help you with this intervention? I'm a counselor by trade. Is there anything I need to know about you or your culture to support you in this therapy session or in the future therapy sessions? So you can take that question and apply it right across the board to support you in your work. Why do we need an Indigenous framework? First of all, how we frame the challenge will inform how we seek a solution. By focusing our efforts on tracking progress towards our most important values and aspirations, we become communities that are working towards health and wellness rather than documenting deficits. So today you're going to hear me talk about a lot about strengths-based, and I will go over that later in the talk, but from an Indigenous perspective, it is really important to come from a strengths-based paradigm. And okay, so sorry, I'm just getting a little bit turned around here. So the Cultural Responsive Framework, which I'll talk to you about its founding in a little bit, really supports a paradigm shift. The current Western paradigm of health and education and policy delivery has failed Indigenous people, and it's reactionary rather than preventative. Western biomedical approaches to health focus on a deficit-based model, the absence of disease, unlike culturally based healing that addresses wellness in a holistic manner. And you'll hear me say this throughout the talk as well. Holistic being the mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual aspects of the self. And in Saskatchewan, a new Indigenous framework has been developed by the First Nations people here, and it's key to improving Indigenous health and wellness. Indigenous culture and knowledge should be incorporated into every health, education, any service delivery and policy development. Solutions must reflect what we call here the Mi'omakotawin, which is the Indigenous concept of health. Again, it's the spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical well-being. This involves a holistic preventative approach that focuses on the long term. One of the things I'd like you to really think about in this webinar, and as you move forward into your own practice of whatever field you're in, is that you think about problematized and deficit-based thinking. I think this is one of the most important pieces of this talk. A lot of people do not understand that even terms like closing the gap are problematic ways of thinking, as Indigenous health is then measured against non-Indigenous health. And it is likely that those gaps will close when non-Indigenous health declines rather than by Indigenous health increasing. So using terms like closing the gap is really not an effective measure or effective way of speaking about Indigenous health and well-being. Again, it's that Western biomedical approach always focuses on a deficit-based model. A strengths-based approach facilitates wellness by building the pathways to resistance. One of the things that's very, very important to know is the colonial context, especially in North America. Specifically, I'm in Canada right now. It is so important to know that history has had complex effects on the structure of communities, the individual and collective identity, and the mental health of Aboriginal peoples. And why is it important to know? I hear all the time, why haven't your people gotten over it? Why isn't this done? It's not done. First of all, it wasn't very long ago that this occurred, and it's not done because of the intergenerational effects and the compounded trauma that is being passed on through that. One of the things we know happened is in the intergenerational trauma is that we have a need for truth and reconciliation. In Canada in particular, right now there's this reconciliation movement, but if you notice, the reconciliation is occurring without the word truth in front of it. I often find that the challenges I have when I do public speaking, and I've been doing it a lot lately, is when we begin to speak the truths, we have an enormous resistance. We've all been structurally denied the opportunity to know the truth. Therefore, we are all in a similar situation with our history. We all need to learn what has happened in the past and how it is affecting us moving forward. Canada's history, and I would say North America's history with Indigenous people, and history across the planet with Indigenous people, has been pretty dark. The historical context when one is working with Indigenous peoples in Canada is crucial. The legacies of colonialism are ubiquitous and tenacious. The trauma of colonization and the residential school system remains embedded in the lives of Indigenous people through direct transmission and intergenerational transmission. So even in my own family, my generation, I didn't go to residential school, but my son's grandfather went to residential school. And that impacted how his father interacts in the world, which then impacts how my 6-year-old interacts with the world. So we try very much to block that intergenerational transmission. But when your whole family is affected by trauma, there are consequences to that, and we live those on a daily basis. For example, I have had a brother commit homicide, suicide. I've had lost a sibling to addiction. So I think that, you know, even though I perceive well and I have a PhD and a doctorate degree, and a lot of us Indigenous people do, we also have trauma reeling through our families. Without reparation and healing, such trauma is compounded by racism and inequity in health, education, governance, and policy systems. For Indigenous people, endemic poverty and attitudes towards health further compound these barriers from at the earliest age. But I'm really excited that new evidence reveals that recovery from colonization is grounded in cultural healing practices. And for example, in the land, the language, the ceremony, and the traditional teachings. Why this is important for academics and for healthcare professionals is that we always need evidence. Now, First Nations people don't need evidence to support that we already knew we had protective factors built into our health and wellness systems, but we don't have Western-based evidence. So if you look, I cited this in the slides, the Fidelity Van Dyck article. It's a very beautiful study. I would suggest it is a good read, as to see how Indigenous health has been quantified and how the protective factors of culture and ceremony have demonstrated as a healing mechanism for Indigenous peoples. Actually, we are actually finding, we have a First Nations hospital nearby here that's open to anyone, and we are actually finding that non-Indigenous people who go to that hospital have better outcomes than any of the other hospitals because of the holistic factor of addressing the mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical well-being. I want you to look at this tree for a moment and realize that identify this tree, and when you look at this tree, look at it from the roots up. I struggled with this image. My graduate student came up with this next set that I'm going to show you, and I struggled with it because I looked at it from the trees down, unlike the way a tree actually grows. So when we talk about this tree today, think about it from the roots growing up. So you have these what are called determinants of health. You have structural, you have intermediate, and you have proximal. The structural are at the bottom, and I'll just get to that here. It's the political, the ideological, the economic, and the social foundations. We understand the role of colonialism as a determinant of health. We see the leaves, we try to fix the leaves, but it doesn't change anything. If we want real change, we have to address the roots. So when you think about the roots, you have to look at the problems in order to understand and hope to change what is happening with the leaves. So if what we fed the roots is residential school and structural removal from our homes and our kinship, then the next step at the intermediate phase, we're not going to have good relationships to our ceremonies because they've been disrupted. We won't have our knowledge sharing that's going on. So that's where, as we grow, as our tree grows, we have problems there. And then when you notice the leaves actually represent the stress responses to stress and trauma, which come out in terms of illness, poverty, domestic violence, and addiction. So what happens a lot is we write these grants and we develop these programs and we do these health interventions and we trim the leaves on the tree consistently without change. Our team operates from the idea that we have to go at the root level in order to really make change. We have to address the cause, not just trim the leaves. We have to go in and really force that root to change. And that is colonialism. And that's a very difficult thing to change, and First Nations people are on the lead of that, as are our allies. Colonialism is a determinant of Indigenous health. I've not seen that much in the literature other than by Indigenous scholars, but I think it's time that all people who work in the area of structural determinants of health realize that colonialism is the key factor for our own health and well-being. Colonialism has not ended, it occurs daily. It encompasses the complex past and present factors impacting health and the life of Indigenous people. It has interrupted access to land. It has provided an economic setback to our ways of life and knowing and caused poverty. It has brought foreign disease and dependency upon Western medicine, which is further subjugation. Residential schools and their policies have forced us to lose our culture, our language, our families, and our communities, and the intergenerational trauma, which I've already mentioned, past, present, and ongoing. The colonial experience is filled with relocation and confinement to reserve. So here in Canada, we actually had what was called a pass system. Not too long ago, in order to even leave your reserve, you had to have a pass from the Indian agent to leave. You were separated from family. So my son's grandfather was kidnapped at age 6 when he went to residential school. You might actually know his story. He's Fred Sasakamoose. He was the first treaty Indian that played hockey for the NHL. And so his story is pretty well known here in Canada, and he talked about his rape at the age of 6. And when he disclosed that rape during the Truth and Reconciliation hearings, no one in the family knew that he had been raped, including his own wife. And because he was so prominent in the country, or actually in the world for hockey, it made headlines. And the headline said, NHL hockey star raped at age 6. And that's how our family found out that that happened. And it put our entire family and extended family into trauma for several months after that headline came out. The other thing is that we in the research area, we're often treated as test subjects. We're not researched with, we're researched on. So the larger social structural problems that persist and risk continuing the assault on the identity and vitality of Indigenous peoples. This is what a healthy tree or a healthy system would look like. This is what we could expect if the roots were fed properly. And as health providers or educators or policy workers within Indigenous communities, we need to ask ourselves, what roots are we planting? When it comes to Indigenous people, relationship is the key foundation. How do I establish authentic relationships with Indigenous people? Our question really needs to change from how do I work with Indigenous people to how can I establish authentic relationships with Indigenous people? That is the way to engage in a relationship, and that is what I want you to take away from today. We need to have a new perspective to face new challenges. We need to start looking at some of the roots of that tree, at the structural determinants of health. We need to start by understanding a different worldview, and this might cause some of us discomfort, but it's worth exploring. And when I say it causes discomfort, I'm going to give you a personal example. So I sit on a research team as the research director of our wellness wheel. It is mostly non-Indigenous because we have epidemiologists and physicians and researchers. And in this particular area in Regina, we're really lacking in capacity here, but our goals are to build those capacities. So when we had an engagement with 8 of our communities at this very long table, I had the community sitting to my right and my research team to my left, and me as the half-breed in the middle, which I thought was apropos. And one of the things that I went over with them is this whole concept of strengths and deficit-based. Now, I thought that physicians and epidemiologists would know the difference between strengths-based and deficit-based. For example, a deficit-based measure might be a scale of stress or anxiety or depression. A strengths-based measure would be a scale of post-traumatic growth, resiliency, etc. So when I tried to warn them that on this study that we're doing on HIV and AIDS and Hep C, that the communities would not like these deficit-based measures, I didn't really realize at the time that they wouldn't understand what I was saying. So in the room, when the communities, and sometimes communities can be pretty direct, they were very clear that they did not want deficit-based measures. And my team was very uncomfortable with that because all they've ever known is deficit-based measures. All Western Academy ever teaches is deficit-based models of health, of everything. So I watched my team squirm and sit in discomfort. And I realized that this is a point of growth, that we have to be, if we're going to work with Indigenous peoples, we have to be willing and able to take the heat when we don't do things right. And just because I'm Indigenous, first of all, I'm a half-breed. From both sides of the border, and I'm not from every community. So when I go into a new community, it's just as if I'm going into a foreign land and I have to learn the protocols alongside of everyone else. I have to build the relationships with the elders from the ground up. I have to get to know what they want and need. I have to identify their assets. So I'm not exempt from this just because I'm Indigenous. We also need to look at a relational worldview, and this is and I don't just mean interpersonal. This is a very complex idea for for Western-based thinkers. It's relationships with people and with families and community, but it's also relationships with the land, with the spirit, with the culture. It's a holistic approach. So this perspective allows us to humanize the world and break down barriers that have been built through colonial thinking. So I think of the universe as a co-partner, that everything is alive and can be engaged with. So we do things like land-based therapies, animal therapy, horse-based healing. We interact, you can see, like, I'll go over this room in a little bit, but we built this room as a decolonized counselor training space. You can see behind me the rock. The elders, when they talked to us about building this space, I'm so glad I'm presenting in this room, actually wanted the elements, the physical elements. They wanted plants, they wanted rocks, they wanted water, they wanted fire, they wanted those things in this space. So really understanding that a lot of the healing we do is actually on the land itself. We might take a group fishing, we might do high tanning with them. High tanning is a very meditative experience. There's a lot of protective factors in Native culture across the planet that were built into our systems. We had natural ways of healing that have been disrupted through colonization. So it's really important to understand that even though we might be healing in a Western-based hospital, there might be something from our culture or from the world that we need to embed into our healing experience to make that holistic for us. Excuse me. I adapted the 4 R's of research, of Indigenous research, to the 5 R's of Indigenous relational accountability. Some would say that these are the ethics of Indigenous work. They're pretty simple, but they're unique to non-Western people. Don't actually think in this way. So first of all is respecting of the Indigenous cultural identity, wherever that is on the spectrum. The relevance to the Indigenous perspective and experiences. And this one, the reciprocity, is key. And what I mean by reciprocity is that when you ask for something or you give, you have to give back. So for example, as a researcher, I would never go into a First Nations community and sort of impose my will upon them. I would ask what they need, and then in return, I would give something of myself. So sometimes we offer that in the form of tobacco or cloth. It would really depend on the protocols of the community. I'll give you another example. In the 8 communities that we have some HIV programming going on, one community has created its own ethics. It's a beautiful document, and I would really like the other 7 communities to have access to that. But we have to first think about what's reciprocal. So we can't just give that to the 8 communities and let this one community who did all that work just leave it out there. There has to be a give and take, and we're in the process right now of establishing what would that give look like. Would it be a tobacco offering? Would it be an exchange? Would it be, you know, back in the day, it would be, we would offer hides for this. So we are right now in the process of trying to take this, you know, we work in these domains of Western and Indigenous ways of knowing. So this is a unique thing for us to sit here and find out what the community would like to be given in order for them to share their ethics across. It's a very complex concept for my research team to understand, but it's a super important one, because if you cannot just take from community, and this is where research has gone wrong in the past. It's gone in, it's been exploitive. We come in, we take what we want, we write our articles, and we leave the community behind. I also talk about the role of responsibility in one's own life and through participation. So in the same research meeting that I had with my team, and the team sitting on my left and the communities are on my right, I said to them, and some of them flew in from other provinces for this research meeting, that you have a responsibility to these communities, that our grant is 5 years, but after 5 years, you just don't helicopter in and helicopter out, or parachute in and parachute out. You build lifelong relationships, and you have a moral obligation to continue the work. And my entire team burst out laughing, which was so interesting, because the First Nations people did not burst out laughing. And when my team realized that I was serious, they took a step back and they thought, wow, this is an incredible responsibility. So if you want to work with Indigenous people, it's not a one-off. It's not something you're just going to go do and take away and walk away. And the other R that I added, which is the result of my PhD, Carrie LaValle's work, is on reflexivity. And this is Maggie Kovach's work as well. But what she did is she talked about the role of the co-constructed relationship. So from an Indigenous perspective, we would say that in reflexivity, it's that you have to leave a transformed person. How did your experience in this role with Indigenous people impact you? How did it transform you? How are you different because of this? Reflexivity is something I teach in my research classes. I think it's a super important piece, because if you don't have some element of transformation, you might be doing something wrong. And one of the things to think about when it comes to that responsibility piece is that from an Indigenous, this is a pan-Indigenous teaching, but the 7 generations teaching, which really indicates that we cannot simply think of our own survival. We have to think of each new generation as responsible to ensure the survival of the next 7 generations. So I can't speak for everyone, but I know that my generation was taught from birth that I have a responsibility to make this world better for the next 7 generations. And when you think that way and you breathe that way and you live that way, it's a very different way of knowing. When you throw that cup out the window in your car, you really have a second guess in your head is, what is that doing for the next 7 generations? So it's a beautiful way of holding your own self accountable. Let's just get into the culturally responsive framework here, which is why we're having this session. So the culturally responsive framework was a very beautiful framework that was founded here in Saskatchewan. It's just an amazing thing that occurred. I've never been a part of anything like it before. And the reason is in 2008, a memorandum of understanding was signed by what we call our Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations. That's here in Saskatchewan. It's our governing body. It oversees the 74 First Nations communities, Health Canada, and the Saskatchewan Ministry of Health. Now, I won't spend a lot of time talking about how it was founded, and you can look more into that in the article that we wrote that's cited in this talk. But basically, 3 years of Indigenous engagement went on. The elders and the knowledge keepers and the wisdom keepers developed a framework, which was online at the FSIN's website. And then they approached Indigenous scholars, myself being one of them, and they asked us to enliven it into an academic theory. So from inception, this is entirely Indigenous-led and Indigenous-driven. 10 years ago, you may not have had Indigenous scholars who could enliven it into a theory. So I'm probably 2.5, third generation PhD. So to me, this is amazing. Usually I say I can't speak for First Nations people. I won't speak for a specific community, but in this case, the First Nations people of Saskatchewan have spoken for themselves and identified the CRF as being the key factor of how they want to move forward in changing health service delivery in Saskatchewan. Okay, so the purpose of the CRF is to ensure that health services, and I would, again, say education, policy, governance, services available to and accessed by Saskatchewan Indigenous peoples will be respectful and accommodate their unique cultural practices and beliefs. The CRF aims to help organizations improve the health experience of First Nations patients and clients in the provincial healthcare facilities and institutions. What I love about Indigenous culture and our culture in general is that we don't ever just look at it to serve ourselves. We look at it to serve all people. And so the beauty of the CRF is that it has this focus on ensuring that the cultural needs and differences are understood and accommodated by both systems, by the healthcare providers in all aspects of health services, and by Indigenous people as well. The CRF draws on the collective wisdom of the elders and the knowledge keepers and the leadership. So it went from consultation at the level of community, it went to Indigenous leadership at the role of chiefs, and then it went into the scholarship of Indigenous scholars and health practitioners. It's a beautiful, beautiful model. So together we are working to challenge the assumptions of privileging Western intellectual practices. And we call it the ICRT or the CRF. It's a model created and owned by First Nations people living within Saskatchewan's borders, but the fundamental principles can be locally adapted and applied. So I know I'm speaking First Nations heavy and not including Métis in this. However, the Métis were not part of the engagement session, so that's where I don't want to speak for them. However, because of its local adaptability, it can be used across all frameworks and all people. There are 3 strategic directions of the culturally responsive framework. And when I started, this came from the CRF, from the elders. When I started actually writing the theory, I'd never written a theory before in my life. Don't know that I will again. Pretty challenging to do. But one of the things that happened is that I started living and breathing these 3 strategic directions in every area of my personal life and in my work. First of all, it's the first one, which is beautiful, is to restore First Nations community-based health and wellness systems, which sounds easy, maybe not so easy. The second, again, it's that looking holistically at the middle ground, or some call the ethical space, for engagement between mainstream and First Nations systems and worldviews. And the third is to transform mainstream service delivery to be culturally responsive and to guide research that continuously improves the well-being of Indigenous peoples. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on each one of these to tell you how we actually achieve cultural responsiveness. This is where I think up till about 4 months ago, I've been presenting mostly on the founding of this theory, but people are really wanting the nuts and bolts of what they can do in their own systems to actually achieve cultural responsiveness, and that's what this next part of the talk will do for you. So when you think about restoring First Nations community-based health and wellness systems, you as an individual cannot do that. But one of the things that you can support in your area of work or in your area of where you operate is you can help to revitalize First Nations languages. Now, if you're not a speaker yourself, you can certainly help drive funding sources to this. You can work with elders on getting different programs for youth to revitalize the languages, but this is a key factor. One of the things that I find is, especially in communities impacted by colonization, in particular Christianity, is there might be a resistance to use the word culture. But if you drive it back to land and language, it's across the board 100% uptake of that. So I would just focus on language and land if you're in an environment that's heavily colonized. The second the elders tell us is important is to teach the medicines. That doesn't mean you teach the medicines. That means that the medicines are being taught within communities and that we're restoring that to our elders so that they can pass on that intergenerational knowledge. And the third is to restore First Nations ceremonies as the source of education in health and First Nations communities. The second piece of this is to establish the middle ground. And I will talk a lot more for the rest of the talk on this middle ground, or what we also call the ethical space. It's that place of engagement where mainstream and where Indigenous and non-Indigenous come together. And it's a place where you have to build relationships and partnerships within and between these systems. It's also the place where I find the most tension, mostly because people think they're ready to get into a middle ground, in particular the allies, the non-Indigenous people, and yet because we've been structurally denied the opportunity to learn the truth, what I find sometimes in the middle ground is people are learning for the first time about the oppressions of First Nations people, and they have emotional reactions such as anger, guilt, and shame. And what happens often in that setting is that you have to disrupt the healing of the activity that's going on to help the non-Indigenous people who are learning for the first time that these things happened in our history, and that a lot of times people are really angry they didn't know that there was a residential school down the street and that they didn't know what was going on. So there's a lot of anger, there's some guilt, and there's some shame. That disrupts our process and our ability to move forward in the middle ground. If you're one of those people, what I would suggest is not entering a middle ground space or place until you've done your own decolonizing work and learned how to become a proper ally. Now, if everyone's prepared and we're all ready to go and we're ready to position that middle ground in that space, then we can start to move forward together in a good way. And the third is to transform that mainstream service delivery to become culture responsive. So the objectives here are to foster education and culture responsive healthcare, and again, education policy, governance care, develop culturally competent and safe policies and programs, strengthen First Nations health workforce. So again, this is where I think most of my work is focused on. We don't have capacity. We don't have many First Nations physicians. We don't have many First Nations scholars. So we really have to strengthen all of our workforces. And one of the questions, and I think I say it at the end of the talk too, is where do I begin? How do I start this journey? Well, look around you and ask your colleagues. And if you don't have Indigenous colleagues, then that's where you begin. And you start advocating for the hiring of Indigenous people. And the fourth is to create space in health service delivery and education service delivery, a space such as this for Indigenous knowledge and approaches to health and wellness. But I would caution here, the building of a space alone is not adequate. For example, where I gave birth to my son here in Regina at the General, there was a ceremonial space. I was not allowed off board to take my child into that space. Now, I eventually did get off board because I had a midwife who was the physician of record who signed me off, but the physician would not sign me off. So I was able to take my baby into the ceremony room, and we were able to have a bringing in ceremony. But if we create these spaces and places in our education and health systems and our own people can't access them, it really does nothing for us at all. I'm giving you this slide. I think this slide is a really crucial one. I would keep this slide with you if you're actually thinking of doing this work, because it allows you to think about things you probably haven't before. And if there's things on this slide that you don't understand, then this is a place where you could do some deepening of your own work. I call it homework or deepening of your work. So for example, if you're doing a process of any kind, did you include time for relationship building with the community members? Did you include time for ceremony? Did you budget for community engagement? Did you budget for ceremony? Did you budget for travel, tobacco, cloth, compensation? We always should give some kind of compensation to our elders and knowledge keepers. Supports. Do you know what supports the community already has? Are you looking at them from a deficit base, or are you looking at them from a strengths base? Do you know what they need? Have they told you what they need? Transparency. I get this a lot. Does the community understand what you're doing? If the community doesn't understand what you're doing, it doesn't matter how wonderful the thing is you're trying to do, it will not be well received. And consultation, have you added space for community input? I would keep the slide with you if you want to do this work. It's really helpful. What are some of the benefits of cultural responsiveness? Well, we know that consumer literacy is improved when seeking healthcare and treatment, if they feel safe to go somewhere. You know, one of the things when we built this lodge here, we built it under engagement with communities from this treaty area who told us what it should look like, so that when Indigenous people come here for therapy or group counseling, and we will be talking about Natawihowikamik shortly, which happens in this room, that they feel safe. I was a little hesitant building this in a Western institution of higher education because I thought, are those women, we have women, the Natawihowikamik group, who are the women who suffer from intimate partner violence, who come here for their group counseling. I was worried they wouldn't want to walk into a Western institution. However, because we're on the second floor here, so they have to come through these Western walls to get to these walls. But the overall feeling and interpretation that we've got from the women is that they feel very safe in this space, and this is a very, very healing place for them. So assuring patient safety and quality assurance is super important, and business practices and best use of resources. I did have a question. I did this talk recently, and I had a question about, you know, what artwork should I put on the wall? We didn't just slap artwork up on this wall. We did engagement, and we talked to elders and community members about what they would want to feel culturally safe, not what we thought they would want. So there's a really big difference. Again, I go back to that middle ground. In the middle ground, Indigenous people should be taking the lead, and that's often where I find the rub. Non-Indigenous Western people often come from a paradigm that Indigenous people don't know how to take the lead, or don't know what's good for them, or need that parentalized support. We actually don't. We are on the ground. We are on the forefront of making these types of theoretical models. We are doing our own work, and we're doing it pretty well. We just need to be listened to by the people in power. So there's an assumption that the lack of culturally responsive care is in fact a major contributor to health disparities. I'm going to talk a bit about the middle ground. So in the middle ground, you have, the first step is to develop it. And again, if I say things that you don't understand, this is a really good place for you to take notes and go in deep in your work. I have some citations on there that you can do further reading. So ethical space came from Willie Ermine. He's up here in Sturgeon Lake, and he talks about this cooperative spirit between Indigenous peoples and Western institutions in order to create new currents of thought. So that's a really beautiful space and place. Again, it's where Indigenous and non-Indigenous people come together. And then I would add that that's where Indigenous people would take the leadership. There's this model here that we use often. It's called two-eyed seeing. It comes out of, I believe, the Mi'kmaq communities with Albert Marshall, and it's to see with the strengths of Indigenous knowledge and the strengths of Western knowledge and to use them together. And then I added this third bullet called harmonizing, and this again comes from my PhD student who's doing this beautiful study right now of working with elders who use both Western-based and traditional methods of healing from addictions. And our elders say that addictions actually was not an Indigenous sickness. It was a sickness brought on by Western intrusion and disruption. So therefore, they believe, this group that we're interviewing, believe that you actually do need to use Western and Indigenous ways of knowing to heal from addictions, because addiction is what they refer to as the white man's sickness. So it's not going to be healed only with our culture, according to some of the elders. So my PhD student, Carrie LaValle, came up with this term called harmonizing. And what we decided to do is kind of take that ethical space and that two-eyed seeing and harmonize it rather than to pick one over the other. So we identify that it's within this area of the ethical space that the strengths of Indigenous ways and the strengths of, and here's where we've altered things a bit, evidence-informed Western approaches are considered. And that means considered. You may have an evidence-informed practice that comes in that is phenomenal and works really well, but if it does not harmonize with the culture, we toss it out. And that's a big stunner to some people. And an example of that might be one-on-one talk therapy in an office. Maybe there's studies that show that it works really well, but we have evidence that shows that it does not. And so one-on-one talk therapy in an office will probably likely not work for First Nations people. And so we talk about that harmonizing. We might take them out on the land and go on a fishing trip with them, and that's where our therapy might occur. Some middle ground actions that you could do would be to host regular gatherings that bring together health partners to discuss culturally responsive care with the First Nations communities that you serve, feature promising practices in the area, and explore opportunities for potential partnership models. You could establish and strengthen agreements that formalize these partnerships between First Nations communities and organizations and mainstream health systems and organizations, and offer shared roles and responsibilities. You can establish, and I think in Saskatchewan we really need this, and establish an independent body that Indigenous patients and families may address their healthcare concerns and mediate issues between both systems. Right now we don't have anything like that. I'm going to speak about what we call the protective factors. The protective factors come from Snowshoe and Star Blanket's work. Again, that's cited in here. And they talk about the 4 specific factors that you would need to have a culture responsive healing model. And it would, if you apply it, would become a decolonized healing approach. So they talk about it being spiritually grounded, community specific, trauma informed, and strengths based. Excuse me. The spiritually grounded perspective, I do notice how I have 2 medicine wheels. We have different treaty groups here, and some of them use the medicine wheel on the right and some use on the left. So that's why you'll see 2 medicine wheels there. Research practice, or any practice that involves Indigenous worldviews, holistic view of wellness, it's connected to family, community, and land, the use of ceremony, the integrating of traditions and culture would help it be spiritually grounded. So if you're in a middle ground, an example of that might be you open in prayer, you open in smudge. Sometimes we do community engagement. The community asks us to come in the night before and they have a sweat lodge, and we are not allowed to do any discussions of work until the next day after the ceremony's been done. So spiritually grounded takes into consideration the culture of the community that you're working with. I'm just going to back up for a moment. This slide demonstrates that they're interactive, overlapping, and interrelated. So you're not going to have, they're not dissected. These are all overlapping. So by being spiritually grounded, you are being community specific because you're following in the middle ground the protocols of that community. A community specific perspective provides ongoing transformations of identity. It's led some groups to do very well. The health of the community appears to be linked to a sense of local control and cultural continuity. We can go in and tell a community that this approach to HIV is the best one, but if they could come up with that themselves, it would have a lot more buy-in, and we find that across the board. Communities aren't ready to start testing an HIV until they're ready. They're not ready to start treating HIV until they're ready, and there's nothing that we're going to say or do that's going to change their mind. And then to support initiatives that follow the vision of the unique community based on the project. So it could change and vary depending on community. There's no one size fits all. I think that frustrates a lot of non-Indigenous people trying to do this work, is you think that if I learn X, then I can apply that across the board, and you absolutely cannot, for multiple reasons, many including the fact that colonization has impacted us all differently and we're at different stages of our identity. The trauma-informed perspective. This might be a common term, especially in the States right now, considering all the trauma that's going on over there. But in general, the trauma-informed perspective is, first of all, it's not just good enough to know what trauma-informed is as a concept. That's not good enough. And this one I'm going to be really stressful about. We as health practitioners, educational practitioners, must be trained in trauma-informed care and practice. Every single one of us on the planet has a responsibility right now. I consider this an ethical responsibility for all of us working with any human that has experienced any type of trauma. This is not Indigenous specific. It is another example of how engaging an Indigenous framework supports all people because of its holistic nature. But in general, especially if you're working in health and education, with the influx of refugees and immigrants coming from war-torn communities, with the amount of domestic violence that we see and the amount of intergenerational trauma, I find it absolutely ethically responsible that all of us are trained in this area. And the strengths-based perspective I've woven throughout this talk a lot. But in particular, what I like about the strengths-based perspective is it attempts to identify what resources an individual or community has to positively address problems. It's a model that focuses on developing assets. So as people develop greater awareness of their own strengths, they will be able to take control of their lives and make appropriate decisions to empower themselves and look for opportunities for growth. Sometimes I get challenged by Western-based researchers and physicians. And I'm going to be really clear when I say this, strengths-based does not mean ignoring the historical and current social realities facing First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples and the associated negative consequences to focus on positive. So we're not just brushing over the negatives that have occurred just to focus on positives. That's not it at all. Rather, strengths-based health promotion facilitates wellness by building on the pathways to resilience. So it's acknowledging the past through a trauma-informed lens and then building on strengths and assets. So cultural responsiveness may be viewed as a viable strategy to improve the links between access, equity, equality, and safety, better health outcomes for cultural and linguistically diverse populations, and as a strategy to enhance the cost effectiveness of all service delivery. So in this slide, which is the first time I've ever presented in this room in this way, you have a juxtaposition between what's a health clinic here in Regina, and then you have our lodge. This is called the Natawihowikamik Healing Lodge and Wellness Clinic. It's located here in the Faculty of Education in our Indigenous Counseling program at the University of Regina. Dr. Angela Snowshoe and I worked on the development of this with a grant to examine what elements, concepts, and processes are needed to create an Indigenous healing space that allows Indigenous healing practices to be integrated into the counseling setting. The project was based on the premise that places are not neutral, that they are alive and impact relationships, and I discussed that a little bit earlier. So this is our lodge. It's a beautiful space and place. I will, if I have time at the end, I'll pan around so you can see the room. The counselor room itself, the group space that I'm sitting in, has a star on the floor that represents a star quilt. There are rocks on the wall. There are teepee poles in the ceiling, which I'll pan up shortly to view. But I just want you to notice on the slide on the right, you can sort of see what might look like teepee poles. That was actually a major mistake. We had planned to put our teepee poles in with ceremony with the elder, and I came in from the summer after fasting for those poles, only to find these big clunky poles put in the ceiling. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we got that fixed. The Natawihowikamik program is the Women's Intimate Partner Violence Support Group that's in this room. It has in here, we have it in Regina, Moose Jaw, and Prince Albert. It has, this particular group, I believe, has 21 women. I would never recommend group therapy being at over 12, but our facilitator is this amazing trauma-informed arts-based therapist who just wants to keep taking more and more women and keep taking them as a return. And in this room, we address the mental and physical needs of women who have experienced intimate partner violence, who self-identify as Indigenous. The program consists of trauma-informed, artistic, and cultural programming. Participants engage in cultural and creative activities to increase stress management skills, social support networks, knowledge of traditional Indigenous culture, and to address health and social issues related to colonization. We have in this group the expressive arts therapist, which is in two of the groups is an Indigenous woman in Regina. We didn't have one who had that knowledge. And then we have an elder, a knowledge keeper, and we also have a domestic violence advocate present at every single group. In Regina, the thing that I find most interesting is I wonder if it's grown so much because of this space. And when I last met with the women, out of the 21, 20 were out of their domestic violent relationships. And I've been working in the area of domestic violence for many years, and I've never seen that. So we are hoping to engage in some future studies about the role of this space in particular in healing. Again, here's some more pictures of our lodge. The name Natawihowikamik actually came from the elders in a sweat lodge ceremony. They came out and told us that the way it translates is this is a place where healing occurs, but also a place where one goes to heal. So it has a sort of double meaning. I put the name Wellness Clinic on it because I can't believe this is going out to 1,800 people, but I'm just going to say it. I had so much resistance after this space was built that I had to literally fight with my own faculty because they wanted to use it for every single thing they could think of. And we had to put pretty tight protocols on this space and indicate if you're not using it for counseling, if you're not using it for Indigenous ways of knowing, and you're not using it for some of the unique technologies we have here, you really don't have a reason to be in here. And that has caused a bit of a kerfluffle. And so one of the things that I have thought about in my work is, do I ever want to bring our culture into a Western space again? Because we lose control of it. And those are questions you should think about if you're enacting on this work. Again, another view of our lodge. I didn't know I'd be presenting in here today. We didn't have the technology set up, so you're actually kind of getting to see it in a different way. This is the problematic poles. So I had fasted for the next set of poles. I had spent a year talking to elders about the kind of wood. I mean, I went, like, in a way, it was my own personal spiritual journey of developing this place and space. And ironically, I came in after the summer. These poles were installed. I wept like a baby, and I asked them, why did you do this? And they made up some excuse. And then I asked them if they were going to take them down and put up the real poles, and they said they would not. It would be too costly, and they were cemented in. But here at the U of R, we have a strategic plan on indigenization, and we also have this group of people who talk about reconciliation without truth quite often. And so one of the things I said is the willingness that you are to reconcile with Indigenous people is the amount of reconciliation that you're going to rip those poles out and put the proper ones in. And it took 6 months, but I held them accountable. and they did put in the proper polls. And the women were also in therapy under both sets of polls, and they told us that there was a huge difference for them. So a lot of non-Indigenous people came in under the first set of polls and thought it was beautiful, and it was beautiful, I guess. But when you look at it now, you actually feel like you're walking into a healing lodge in a healing space. So in summary, the principles of Indigenous health are very dependent upon the Indigenous group that you're working with and your partners, which can vary considerably based upon the situation, the community's needs, as well as the community's capacities and interest in engagement. There's no cookie cutter approach, which often contributes to hesitancy among those interested in getting involved with Indigenous health and well-being. There is a simple solution: just ask your Indigenous colleagues and partners, and if you don't have any, then that becomes your first step. I'm going to forward to the very end slide. These slides are there for you as a resource if you are going to take on engagement, but the very last slide, I know a lot of people want to use this work. You can cite it right there. There's the citation for it, and I included my he's now graduated, but my graduate assistant has done, Graham Brace, has done a non-Indigenous, has done a tremendous amount of work on this module and adapting it for the various settings we go in. And I just want to point out on the deepening your work resources, there, if you're in the research area, there's the TCPS2 core online training that's free. I would highly encourage anyone to take it. It has all modules, but I would encourage you to take the module on First Nations and Métis research. And then the OCAP online training, while not free, it's the de facto standard for how Indigenous research should be engaged and how First Nations data should be owned and managed. So those are some resources that I would hope would be helpful to you. And that's my talk, and I think I have a few minutes to spare.
Okay. You do indeed, JoLee.
So would you like me to I would like to pan around the room then so that they could possibly see it.
That would be wonderful.
As long as I don't knock out the cord. And I don't really know. So I don't know what you see. So in this room right now, you'll see, okay, so that piece of art, which I can't zoom in, but that piece of art was created by the women of the Natawihowikamik group. Each group at the end, they run for us about 13 weeks, and we've had 4 groups. They create an art piece. In this particular, in the Regina group, that's what the therapist does. She has them do an art piece. Each one of those people in the art piece was a separate piece of art that the woman created herself, so it represents who she is in the therapeutic process, and then they put it together in the like, I forget what that's called, a collage, I guess. The artist put it together, and then she created that background, and the most beautiful thing happened. The artist reproduced it in small form and gave every woman a framed copy. It was just beautiful, and I actually got a framed copy too. This artwork that you see here on the walls, we tobaccoed one of our artists here, Clifford Dubois, and it was so amazing. When I offered him the tobacco to do the artwork for the room, he immediately started seeing, as soon as I put the tobacco in his hand, he started seeing images. And I'll just point out some really cool things. I don't know if you can see it in detail, but at the bottom is actually a turtle. It's a turtle's back. And there's 2 loons on the door. And Dr. Snowshoe happens to be Loon Clan, and I happen to be Turtle Clan. So he sort of embedded us into this space, which is so thoughtful and beautiful. And then the buffalo, of course. Now what I've done is I've turned all the lights on in the individual counseling rooms so that you can see that there's a wolf room. And then that's the screen. There's a buffalo room. Just some other artwork. Okay, I'm not going to try to make you dizzy, but I want to spin it this way because of the cord real quick. And then over here, we just have some more space. And this was supposed to be my art storage room, but a last-minute engagement and consultation session, the Cookham said, "My girl, you need to make sure you have a kitchen." So that ended up not being my art storage space and is actually the kitchen space. Now I just got to aim this back where I'm sitting. So hopefully the last thing, I guess I should show you, pan up, the teepee poles. So that's when you walk in the room, there's a medicine wheel at the top of the ceiling and the teepee poles that kind of come down. So I actually feel like I'm standing in a teepee. I'm not going to pan down to the floor because it's a little awkward, but that's where I already showed you the star on the floor. So actually I'm standing on a star right now.
JoLee, there's lots of comments about people's amazement and wonder at this room. So now that you're settled, we want to share some of the questions that have come in for your consideration. One of the questions is that one individual that's participating is in a community where there are some who practice traditionally, and there are those who practice Christianity to heal, learn, and grow. And there's quite a divisiveness within the community. And they wonder if you have any ideas on how to engage in a culturally responsive way and with culturally responsive care in such a divisive environment.
Absolutely. That's an excellent question. And I think it's one we encounter in almost every community that we work. So I'll talk about Muskowekwan First Nation because they've given me permission to do so. And Muskowekwan First Nation in particular has been the trailblazer for the Cultural Responsive Framework. They're the ones that actually got us to enliven the framework into a theory. And the reason they did that is because they have the last standing residential school in Canada that's not been turned into something else, and it stands there empty. And they want to build a healing and wellness center in response to residential schools and trauma. So they brought us in about 2.5 years ago, and they have a very small community, and it is equally 50-50 Christian to traditional. One of the things that we actually just did engagement with them after 2.5 years. We've done another set of engagement on the 22nd. And we are at the point of, we've done enough research to know what they want in the healing center, but we're at the point of sitting down with the architects. And so we did community engagement with community members and the architects to decide what the space and place is going to look like. The thing is that when we went in to do the research with them, I did a few scales, and one of the things that I did is I modified a couple. And so I asked questions like, what is your connection to a sweat lodge from 0 to 5, 5 being connected, 0 being none? What is your connection to land? Same scale. What is your connection to hunting, trapping, fishing, language, cooking, picking berries? I asked all these questions. What I noticed is that, and I use words also like prayer, what I noticed is that if you said, what is your connection to culture? The Christians might say 0. There's no connection to sweat. There's no connection to this or that. But if you say, what's your connection to prayer? It was 100%. So that's why I said earlier is that if you take it to land in language and stop using the word culture, you're going to get less resistance. If you start talking to people about restoring the language and restoring berry picking, hunting, trapping, maybe not so much ceremony like sweat lodges and things like that, but if you go back to some of the more traditional aspects of the community, in particular with the language, you'll eliminate that right there. And then, most communities know there's a divide within. So in particular with Muskowekwan, we know that we're building a healing and wellness center. We know that it needs to meet the needs of the whole community. So they came up with what they wanted. They wanted a multi-denominational prayer space in which smudging and all of that could happen alongside of any denomination. And, I was so impressed with them to really think about the possibility that after their communities healed, they would want to open their doors to other people. And they actually said that it doesn't always have to be Native people, which surprised me a bit because, again, I just go back to how loving and giving our culture is. It really looks at healing across. And I think there's this belief that we all need to heal in order for one of us to, if one is sick, we're all sick. It's that connectedness thing. So I would say take it to the language first, take it to restoration of language and land and practices such as the traditional practices. You don't have to have a fight about it. You can accommodate both. I go in sweats all the time and the elder will say, pray in the manner that you know. So it's not about praying in Cree. It's not about praying in English. It's praying in how you move and you operate. So focusing on the spiritual component of the Indigenous community in general and allowing them to dictate what it looks like is the best practice that I've encountered. I have encountered some communities that are a little bit, they have a different kind of Christianity in there and it's a little bit more abrasive and that's a little bit more delicate. But in general, I find that, people have walked both worlds and we, all of us walk both worlds now and we have to accommodate that. It's an excellent question.
Thank you, JoLee. There's so many more questions. One that we'd like you to respond to is, do you specifically address racism and power differences within the framework? And how do you do that, if indeed you do, within the framework?
Well, that's where the establishment of the middle ground comes in. In that middle ground, you position the community first. So that's where, again, that's where I find the rub. If you're finding the rub, the resistance from the non-Indigenous people are not ready to do the work. They're just not. And this is where I get into a rub with my university all the time. You have to let Indigenous people lead. You must. That is just imperative. And if for some reason we are lacking in leadership in that area, then you must bring up those young ones behind and support them. And then, kind of like raising chicks, you have to get capacity built. So of course we need our non-Indigenous allies and partners. My research team would be non-existent if it weren't for that. But at some point, Indigenous people have to have the say about what's going to happen to us as a people. Absolutely. UNDRIP number 19 insists upon it. And I find that UNDRIP number 19 is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Number 19 says there is a duty to consult. And I am constantly holding people accountable for making policy decisions in universities or in healthcare systems in which they've not done a duty to consult. So that would be my comment on that.
Okay. JoLee, another question. Have you developed a tool to help assess the level of culturally responsiveness of an organization so that they can make change and continue to grow in a more culturally responsive way?
Absolutely. We're in that process now, and that is not a one-day process. We've been working on that for the last 3 years with the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations. We are in the process of coming up with culture responsive wellness measures. And what we would like to do in Saskatchewan is eventually get to the place where we have a certification program in which organizations can be pay a fee to become culture responsive and get a certificate, and then have sort of checks and balances to see if they're still following that. And not even the whole organization, like at a university as big as this, it may be the human resources department, it may be a faculty that does it. So we are in that process. It is a time consuming process, in particular because we do it all under engagement. So what we're finding right now is just trying to find the money to engage all 74 communities. Again, we're trying to bring the elders back who developed the Cultural Responsive Framework. So watch for it. It hasn't come out yet, but we are in that process.
Okay, that's encouraging. How do you create a safe space and place for men who have been abusive, exhibited abusive behavior in the past?
So again, I just go back to talking to the men. I can't tell you what he's going to feel is safe. I would say do a small focus group with your clients or your population and ask them what makes them feel safe. Because we had our ideas about what this lodge should look like. Well, first of all, we didn't know it was going to be a lodge. We did not build this as a lodge. We built this as a decolonized counselor training space. It was the elders when they went to the ceremony and had the name that came back, and it came back that it was a lodge. And that freaked me out, because that means I am now a lodge keeper with a huge responsibility that I wasn't planning on having. So I didn't come in here and say, we're going to put this, we're going to do art, we're going to do that. We did consultation and engagement with the treaty people from this community who would use the space. And they told us what it should look like and what it should be like. And so I would say the same thing to you. Go to these men and ask them, what makes you feel safe? What makes you feel empowered? What makes you feel strong? What makes you feel resilient? We in North Central, which is our urban area here in Regina, we actually have a man, he's just a phenomenal nurse named Greg Riel, who got a grant to do a moose hunting program with the urban men. It's not even, so when you think of space, it's not necessarily in a room. He's taking them out onto the land to try to restore that hunting practice and return them to being a provider for the family. That came from community. They a lot of our urban people don't have any cultural teachings or access to it. So it comes from them. The men wanted that, and Greg wrote the grant, got that, and now they're doing this moose hunt together. So I would say do a check-in with the people you're serving.
Okay, and this may be a related question, but a number of participants, JoLee, have talked about serving a wide variety of clients and individuals coming from different backgrounds, different experiences, and how do you make a space welcoming for all without offending or making somebody else uncomfortable?
So again, I go back to the people you're serving and what do they say produces a culturally safe space. It's not just about adding artwork. It's not just about, you could have this beautiful space, but if we act like jerks when you come through the door, that's not going to make you feel safe. So I think it just has to be really, I know people don't often get this because it takes a lot of work to get people together and ask them what they want and then find the money and the resources to put what they want in it. I know that's not something we are used to. We're used to being told, this is the way your health clinic is going to look, this is what you're going to do, and this is how you're going to serve. And we train that way, especially in the medical professions. But this is where we have to, again, take that leap. This is where the Culture Responsive Framework comes in. We have to become champions for this work. I can't go and say that this is going to make everyone feel safe, but I could hold a focus group of some key people to say, what are some elements from your culture that we might bring in here that make you feel comfortable? What are some things that might make you feel safe as a woman? I had really big concerns. In fact, the artwork I showed you on the door, when they first put up that glazing, they had just a tiny quarter of an inch that exposed that someone could look through the window. And I went back and I made them rip it all down because there are clients in here and our clients' identities can't be revealed. These are domestic violence survivors, right? So we have to be thinking about that trauma-informed perspective all the time. And I think if you come from a trauma-informed perspective, it doesn't really matter what the artwork is on the walls. That trauma-informed piece, which is not culturally specific, will help all of us in identifying how to make people feel safe.
Thank you. JoLee, one of the questions that was raised talks about how do you respectfully and supportively encourage family members, and this is coming from a family member, encourage other family members who've experienced residential schools to talk about it when you believe it would be helpful not just for them, but for the other members of the family? And how do you do that sensitively and caringly with respect?
So after my dad told his story and it hit national headlines and all that stuff happened, the family went into trauma. And Grandpa shut himself down for 2 weeks, closed the door, didn't come out, didn't take calls. And then after that second week, I phoned him and he said, I'm fine. I've told my story. And he tells this story, like I'm not talking about his hockey story. I'm talking about that story. He tells his hockey story all the time. He said, I've told my story. The world knows about it. The family knows about it. And the family's in trauma, still in trauma at that time. And he said, I'm done talking about it now and I'm never going to speak of it again. And we said, okay, that's your choice. But the family stayed in trauma. The family stayed in trauma for a long time. And I said, Grandpa, what are we going to do? Like, this brother's freaking out and this one's freaking out. And he's like, that's kind of their problem. They have to work through it. So I guess I would say that you can't force anyone to talk about it. And here in Canada, we had the TRC, we had the Truth and Reconciliation stories, and we had, the time when people, if they were to get compensated for some of the abuses, they had to go in front of adjudication board and they had to tell their story. And so I watched people for the first time in their life in their 60s, 70s, and 80s go in front of a white adjudicator with white lawyers and have to tell their story from kidnapping to the time they left residential school and every single harm that occurred to them in the process, because the harms rated the amount of money they got. So you got a certain amount of harms for having, interfered with your academic career. You had a certain amount of harms for sexual abuse in this way. You had a certain amount of harm 3, 4 if you were slapped in the face, harm 5, 6 if you were raped. And these people left devastated. So I wouldn't suggest necessarily encouraging people to talk about it unless there's a way to process it. Because if you're going to bring up this trauma, you need to know how to deal with this trauma. And not always are we equipped for that in our families. But maybe if you're a ceremony person, you could say, Dad, I really think you would benefit from this ceremony, this lodge, this thing, and go to ceremony and work it out. But I don't think we can really force people to disclose or discuss things that they're not ready to or that they don't want to. But also just sitting down with that family member and saying, like, I think that your experience in residential school is impacting me and my family, and I would like to talk about that, and maybe they would be able to open up, but mostly coming from your perspective, not theirs. This is a very touchy subject because you don't want to re-engage trauma.
Mm-hmm. JoLee, you talked about asking what people need, and even in the answer you just gave, the importance of it's what's right for that individual. And one of the questions says, how do we navigate getting feedback and advice from Indigenous peoples without causing expert fatigue or burnout of the people that we're continually asking?
Yeah, like I think that's really confusing because it depends on what you're doing, right? So like for me, I just don't go ask random Indigenous people how I build this space. I went to key elders who were respected, who had a knowledge base, who could answer those questions. And you know, if you get to know Indigenous communities well enough, you'll start to learn who some of the go-to elders are, who some of the go-to people are. Like I have elders that have no academic background, so I'm not going to drag them into my research team and ask them to analyze data. But I have elders who do that with me. I have elders that sit beside me and can do that work. I have elders that have been chiefs, so they have like really strong political savvy. So we got to ask the right people, and that's where the relation, again, I go back to that relationship piece. You have to build the relationships with the people that you need to work with. So part of this is on you to go out and build the proper relationships and not trying to ask, you know, people that maybe don't want to take an 8-page survey to give you your feedback and get fatigued those questions, right? If you have the right people, then that should just come naturally, but it's up to you to build those right relationships.
Mm-hmm. And maybe we'll end with this challenging question. How do you make structural changes in line with the theory if you do not have the organizational support for reform?
Well, you know, I'm just going to be straight up honest here. That's why I left. That's why I took my research center out of here. I cannot. I have been facing structural racism so painfully over the last while, and it's systemic and it's embedded, and every time we try to address it, it just comes back to this wall. So think outside the box. We took our research center and we took it into a nonprofit organization, and now when community says they need X, Y, and Z, I'll just give you an example. I buy tobacco. I buy, sometimes our communities want actual cigarettes. And if we're having a ceremony or an engagement with 8 communities, I might buy 4 cartons. Last month, they informed me that they created a new tobacco policy that I could only buy $75 worth of tobacco at once. There's only 5 Indigenous faculty at this university. I'm the only community-based researcher. So how many of us do you really think that affects at this institution? Me. So, you know, I just get tired of that game sometimes. It's really frustrating. And instead of fighting the tobacco policy at this university, I really need to be in community bringing HIV interventions up there, right? I don't need to waste my time on the systemic racism, especially at an organization that claims to be indigenizing and decolonizing and having a strategic plan of indigenization. So I took my work outside, and you know, I don't know what else to say about that. We are trying to change the health authority. We're trying to change the health region. We're trying to change academic systems. And our elders said in the Cultural Responsive Framework, if you actually go to the CRF document itself, the elders say that change will only occur with the policies, practices, procedures, and people from within the system. That is not Indigenous people. Change is only going to occur when non-Indigenous people take this leap and do it with our guidance. And until that occurs, we're not making those changes. And that's what I've seen. And I don't want to be negative about it, but I have been working here 8 years. 8 years, and I don't control this space. And this is a ceremonial space. How could this not be controlled by an Indigenous person? So there's a lot to think about. Well, you know, I said earlier, would I replicate this in an Indigenous, non-Indigenous place again, where our elders don't control it? Probably not. Lesson learned. So I think you have to be really careful and let the Indigenous leadership guide you in this process. And if it's not going to happen in the institution where you are, maybe you need to go external.
Mm-hmm. JoLee, there have been so many comments, and we will share the evaluations with you later, but people are so appreciative of the time and the wisdom that you shared today. And our team had the privilege of knowing the care and time that you put into preparing and wanting to make this a valuable experience for the participants. And we so appreciate that. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity, because people have been asking if there are people who would like to do additional training with you to learn more from you about trauma-informed approaches and more about the theory. Is that possible, or is there a way of contacting you? And we want to make sure that we can share that with people.
Yes, it's possible. I'm a little scared with 1,800 people saying that, because I am one person. I am one of 5 Indigenous faculty here. I am one of probably for Indigenous health researchers in our province. So my schedule, like I don't mean I'm on demand, but I feel like sometimes I'm on demand and it's a bit hard. I am doing my best to build those capacities as fast as possible with Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. I do have a really great team that I work with. And so in fact, in the full day workshop, what we really like is to have an Indigenous and non-Indigenous presenter so that we can address things, you know, with both groups. So I would say yes, you could reach me at JoLee at wellnesswheel.ca. That's my email, but also be patient because you know I'm a full-time faculty. I'm actually on sabbatical right now, and you know it's a lot of demand, and I get that there's a lot of demand, which is why I was so willing to share the slides, and I was so willing to share. Like I didn't know if in an hour I could really do anything meaningful, because really to do anything Indigenous, it would be nice that we're all sitting in a room together, that we have an elder opening in prayer, you know, that we have time to get to know each other. Why are you here? Why are you taking this workshop? I would have done all that in an Indigenous setting. That takes time. So I would say that we're aware that that our team has something that's in need. We're trying our best to just disseminate this. And then like emails would be helpful as to what you're looking for. And then if we could sort of gear that. And one of the things we're looking at doing is I'm writing a grant right now. I don't know if I'll get it for a CIHR call for HIV centers in Saskatchewan or in the nation. And we're writing one for Saskatchewan. And that would allow us to leverage some more trainee dollars that we could then really start to put these out. We have modules under development. It's just we are lacking in capacity and the trainers to train it. So we are aware. And if anyone wants to join our research team who's in Saskatchewan, please let me know, because we could really use some on the ground people.
Okay. Thank you so much, JoLee. And
Absolutely.
again, and we will be in touch with follow-up. And on behalf of all participants in our team, miigwech.
Thank you. Bye-bye.